Hey, and welcome back to ERC-6900 plugin development part 2, where we are going to be building a subscription plugin starting from this plugin template that I will link down below. So let's get underway. What I'm going to do is I'm going to start again from this plugin template that we described in the last video. If you haven't seen that one, check it out. We go over some of what's going on inside of this plugin, so we won't have to redo a lot of that in this video, although I will touch on everything, so don't worry if you haven't seen it. So what we'll do is we're going to go ahead and jump in and change this counter plugin over from something that's a little more contrived and just an example, which is this counter plugin. It's good hello world, a good place to start from. We're going to turn it into something a little bit more real world, like a subscription plugin, something that allows you to subscribe to a service so that service can collect a certain amount of funds from your account on a monthly basis. This is something that's really cool that's enabled by smart accounts, is this ability to respond to contract calls. So if you had a contract, or even if you had somebody who owned an externally owned account and they wanted to call in and you allowed them to pull a certain amount of funds from you every month, you could write that logic into a subscription plugin like we're about to do here. Of course, if you had just an externally owned account, you wouldn't be able to do that because they don't have code, right? It's just a public-private key pair. So smart accounts really enable this use case, which is super cool. So let's go ahead and get started here. We're going to build ourselves a subscription plugin, and we'll change just a couple things here. This dependency we are not going to change because I'm still going to install a dependency that's going to do our user app validation so that whenever we want to subscribe to a new content creator or service, we're going to say, is this the owner of the smart account? If it is, allow this user operation to go through. If it's not, then we're not going to allow it to happen. So we're still going to use that same dependency index, which is going to be the only dependency that we install for our subscription plugin. It's going to be an owner plugin. Cool. So all of this right here, we talked about in the previous video, we're not going to worry about, but if you were going to do some validation rules here, you would actually have to adhere to the ones in EIP 7562. We're not going to be using this storage in validation, but if we were, we would have to adhere by those rules. One thing that is interesting to note, in case you did want to use this inside of one of your validations, you can actually use what I'm about to build inside of a validation function. It would be considered associated storage, but I'm not going to go too deep into that in this video because it could get a little bit more complex. But just to let you know that you could use that because it will be considered associated storage. Awesome. So what we're going to do is we're going to create something that is going to allow us to track the data for this subscription. So maybe we'll call it subscription data. So our subscription data, what do we need to know? We need to know how much the person is allowed to take out of our account. The service or content creator is allowed to take out of our account on a regular basis. So what is that amount, right? To keep this simple, I'm going to make this native currency. So whatever the native currency is, maybe Ether, maybe Matic of that particular blockchain that you're deploying to, then we're just going to use that. So we won't have ERC-20s for this, but you could definitely extend this to use ERC-20s if you put in like an address for the ERC-20 contract and put in all the logic that you need to put in there. So we're just going to do native currency for now. The other thing that we need to do is keep track of the last time that the fees were collected. So I'm going to call this like last paid. So that way, every so often, we're going to do 4 weeks. Because here we don't have months, we have weeks. So I'm going to do 4 weeks, but you could definitely like call this every month if you want to do that client side and be able to call in to make it more of a monthly subscription, which may be more familiar to users. But we're going to do every 4 weeks. And what we're going to do is every 4 weeks, we're going to set this last paid. So that way the person collecting the service or content creator cannot collect more often than those 4 weeks. So we'll set it to that regular interval there. And then finally, the last thing we want to do is set an enabled, which is going to just be a flag whether or not this subscription data is enabled so the service can call in or not. By default, this is going to be false, but we can turn it on and then we can turn it off if we need to later on. So instead of having a mapping for account, what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to map from a service. So the person who's allowed to collect it, the collector, to our account, our smart account, to this subscription data. So it's going to be a mapping from an address, which is going to be that service, like I said, to an address to our subscription data for this. You know, it's a relationship between us and the service, or smart account and the service, can they pull a certain amount of funds from our account every month? And if it's enabled, then yes, they can, and they can see the amount inside there. So we're going to go ahead and make this public and call it subscriptions. Great. So that sets up our storage that we want for a plugin. And like I said in the previous video, plugins are singletons, so they're deployed to a single address. And if you need to look up something about subscriptions, it's actually all you have to do is come out to wherever the subscriptions plugin is deployed, and you could just call out and see, does this service map to this particular smart account? Is there subscription data there, and is it enabled, and how much are they allowed to take out, and when was the last time that it was collected? So you can see all that information there. Great. So let's get underway with execution functions. So what I want to do here is, instead of increment, what I'm going to do is subscribe. And I'm going to get rid of a lot of this, and I'm going to say subscribe, and subscribe is going to allow us to subscribe to a service. Let's call it service to keep it consistent across the board. We're going to subscribe, and then we're going to say this is the amount that we're going to subscribe. We're going to allow this service to pull out, and we're just going to make the regular basis 4 weeks to keep this plugin super simple, so we don't have to change the intervals or do any of that sort of logic, but you could definitely extend this to do something more like that. So every 4 weeks, this service is going to be allowed to pull out a certain amount from our account. So if we wanted to look up the subscription, so first off, let's go ahead and just make this change in our subscriptions here. So we need to say subscriptions, and then this is going to be the service, and then the smart account in this case, because this is going to be, and again, in the last video I mentioned, there's 3 ways to call functions. 1 is going to be through user ops. 2 is going to be what's called runtime. It's going to go through the smart contract account directly and then into the plugin. And then 3 would be directly on the plugin. So this is going to actually be a function where we are going to call it through user ops. So this is called through a user operation, and we're going to use that user op validation of the owner to say, is the owner the person using calling this user operation? If they are, then they are allowed to subscribe to this particular service, right? So the person who's actually going to be calling this, if you think about the ERC-6900 flow, is going to be the smart account, right? So you'd have the entry point call into the smart account, and then the smart account is going to call the plugin. So the message sender in this case is actually going to be the smart account. So we would say subscription service message sender is going to be equal to subscription data. And then we're going to need to pass in the amount here. The last paid, I'm just going to set to 0. So you could collect immediately, but you can imagine maybe if you had a subscription that was collecting at the end of the 4 weeks, then you might want to do something where you set it to 4 weeks from now, but I'm just going to set it to 0 so it could collect right away. And then we're going to go ahead and say enabled is true. So let's go ahead and do that. And this is going to go ahead and set up ourselves with a subscription. Or you know what? Now that I think about it, by setting this to 0 in our test environment, we're going to have to wait 4 weeks before we are able to then pull out if we're going to have this function. We'll see it in a sec. When we go to collect, we'll set some logic up that says, when was the last time that they paid, and has it been 4 weeks since then? And then we'll be able to pull those funds out. So we will have to actually wait those 4 weeks. We should be able to do that with like a cheat code in the tests. All right, great. So this is going to be called through a user operation. Let's make sure that our subscription is working properly first. So what we need to do now is, now that we have that set up, we're going to change a few things down here. So our dependencies, interface IDs, again, our dependency is not going to change. I'm going to be using a owner plugin to do the validation of the subscribe. So is this the owner of the plugin? If yes, we're going to allow them to subscribe. So that's not going to change, but our execution functions are going to change. We're going to have an execution function called subscribe. So I'm going to go ahead and do that, and maybe we'll get rid of some of these comments because I don't think they're going to be as relevant with some of the changes that we're making. And then we're going to have this user op validation function. I'm not going to change anything about this because this is a reference again to that user op validation. It's referring to the dependency which we're going to install. It's going to be that user it's going to be that owner plugin that we're going to install in the first dependency of the dependencies array. And then we're going to refer to it and say, this is what you're going to use for the validation of the subscribe function. So this is going to set up that reference to that function there. And then we're going to go ahead and change this increment over to subscribe. Here we're saying that we're going to use the user operation. We're going to be linking together the user operation validation function with our subscribe function here. This is going to make sure that only the owner of the account can call our subscribe function as opposed to before with the increment function. And then finally, what we do want to do is just make sure that it can't be called at runtime. So I'm going to set my subscribe function to always deny runtime functions here. Okay, great. There is one more thing that I do know we need to do. This is getting a little bit ahead of ourselves, but while we're here in the manifest, there's two things actually. So the manifest by default does not allow you to, as a plugin, make calls to an external contract. And the way that it actually needs to be done is if you're a plugin and you want to make calls to an external contract, you actually need to call back into the smart account. And you'll see that in a second. We're going to do this together. As a plugin, you need to call back into the smart account, and then the smart account is going to call out to the external address. Now, by default, this is not allowed. You can list the external addresses that are allowed to be interacted with the smart account through this plugin, or you can turn it on for all of them. In this case, because we have a service or a content creator and we don't know what those addresses are going to be, we are just going to turn it on for all of them. But you could also imagine, like, if you were creating some sort of a protocol smart contract where you wanted to say, this is a smart contract that you can interact with, then you would specify that address specifically. So in this case, we just want to turn it on. So I'm going to say manifest let's see, is it permit any external address? And I'm going to set this to true. So this is actually going to be the two Booleans that I talked about in the previous video. We had this permit any external address. So this allows a plugin to call any external address. We're going to turn that on. Of course, you want to limit permissions as much as possible. That's just good security. So if you really don't need to do this, then you want to actually specify which ones are allowed. What are the permitted external calls that you see below? But for now, we're just going to go ahead and just turn them all on. And then the other thing that we want to turn on is can spend native token. Because like I said, for this subscription, to keep it really simple, we just want to pull funds from the native currency funds of the smart account. So I'm going to go ahead and say can spend native token is also going to be set to true. Great. Okay. So now that's all set up. Our manifest is actually set up everything we're going to need to do for this plugin, I believe. And we still haven't done our collect function, right? And our collect function is going to have to call in to actually pull those funds on a regular basis from the collector. It might be a service or content creator, right? So let's just go ahead and make sure our subscription works perfectly first. So we're going to have to change a few things here. First off, this counter plugin is no longer called counter plugin, although the file is still named counter plugin, but I'm going to want to rename this to subscription plugin. And then over here, we're going to go ahead and rename this as well. And we're going to call this subscription plugin. And wherever counter plugin is, we're going to have to change it around a little bit. So subscription plugin is going to be a new subscription plugin. We're going to get the manifest just like we did for the counter plugin there, and then we're going to go ahead and fill it in to install this subscription plugin. We're going to keep the dependencies the same. Like I said, we're going to use that single owner plugin. So this means that we're only specifying one owner of the smart account, but you could also do other types of ownership. So if you wanted to do like a multi-owner plugin, that's something that's available. You can find it in the Alchemy platform GitHub. You can find it in an audited version of the multi-owner plugin. So this single owner plugin, we're just going to go ahead and use here. And yeah, that should be everything we need to do to set this up. It should be the same as the counter. The one thing that is going to change is when we call it down here with a subscription plugin, and we actually specify the call data inside of the user operation, we are going to need to send some call data here. So the call data is going to change, and this is going to have to change to well, we're going to have to target the subscribe function, right? So we're going to have to target this as our method, and then we're going to have to pass in some parameters, and they are going to be, what are they going to be? Let's go check this here. So it was service and then the amount. Okay, cool. And then another thing that's bothering me here is that this counter plugin is now renamed to subscription plugin.t.sol. Great. Okay. Cool. So now we're going to need to pass in those two things. So let's just go ahead and just create an address for our service, and we'll call this make address service. And then we're going to pass this in as our address. And for the amount, we're just going to pass in 10. So, 10 as a native currency is going to be a really small unit, but whatever. We just want to test to make sure that they could just pull out our subscription plugin and be able to pull funds out. Right now, we only are subscribing. So what we want to do to test this is we want to check that we have successfully subscribed. And in order to do that, we're going to have to call out to the subscription plugin.subscriptions. And this is going to be that public mapping up here. And again, because this is a singleton, we could just call out directly and get this. We're going to need to pass in two things, which is going to be the address of the service and the address of the smart account. So we're going to have to pass those two in to be able to check whether or not this was actually successful. So let's go ahead and pass those two in. I'm going to do subscriptions and then pass in the service. And then I'm going to pass in the smart account, which is going to be the address for our account 1 here, right? This is where we deployed the account. So we're going to need to pull that on over and pass that in. So let's go ahead and do that. Pass in that account. And this is going to return us the subscriptions. So the way that this actually returns is like a tuple. So we're going to want to get out the stuff that we care about, which is going to be, it's going to be returned in this order: the amount, then last paid, then enabled. So what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to grab the amount, and then the last paid, I'm not going to check that one. I guess it should be 0. We could check that if we want. Let's do last paid, and then we could do enabled. Well, last paid would be 0 anyway. Yeah, I'm not going to check that one. It's kind of a useless test. And then we'll do bool enabled, and then set this equal to that. And then we should get those two things out. And then what we want to assert is two things. First off, that the amount is 10, just like we passed in up here in our call data. And then the other thing that we want to pass check is that our enabled is true. Cool. And then if these two things are working, then we know that we have subscribed successfully to this service, right? Because here's the service being passed in, here's our smart account, and our smart account has been set up. So let's go ahead and test this. So I'm going to go ahead and say forge test. Let's see if that works. All right, sweet, it works. So if we change this to like amount 100, let's just make sure that that does not work, right? You always want to check to make sure that, sanity check, make sure your tests are actually working the way you expect. And it looks like that is failing. So great. All right, so we set this up so now we can subscribe, but what about when we want to collect, right? So this is the other way that we're going to be calling a function in our plugin. So in this one, we're calling it through a user operation, but the other way that I actually want to write a function is this one is going to want to be called by the service or the content creator. Whoever's calling in here to collect these funds, they want to call it, and they're going to call it directly. So this is going to be the third way. So this is going to be the first way. This is called through a user operation. And then this one is called directly by the collector. So in this case, the message sender is going to be the collector, right? So we do need to think about like what the security around that is going to be, like when we are trying to call into this one. So let's go ahead and make that address subscriber. So this is going to be us in this case. So the collector is going to say, this is the subscriber that I'm trying to collect from, the smart account. And then we are going to go ahead and say, here's the amount that I want to collect. So the few things that we want to check here, right? We want to make sure, one, that the amount is what's allowed, right? We want to make sure that this amount matches the subscription data amount. Two, we want to make sure that the last paid was before the the renewal cycle before the cycle, which is going to be, let's say last paid was over 4 weeks ago. And then the final thing that we want to test is that it's enabled, right? We want to make sure that it's turned on. So let's just make sure that all those things are true. I'm going to go ahead and get our subscription data here, which is going to be, let's call this subscription, is going to be our subscriptions. And then we'll do message sender because the person calling this, in this case, is going to be the collector, the service that we subscribe to. And then we're going to say subscriber here. So we're looking up our smart account as associated to their collection, their address there. And then we'll get that subscription. We're going to want to get this out of storage because what I'm going to want to do is I'm going to want to modify this so that last paid is set to the block.timestamp after we've checked that all these things are true. And then we're going to go ahead and pay them directly. So let's just check that all these things are true. We're going to want to make sure that the amount is what's allowed. It should probably be exactly what we said, right? I don't know if you want to make it so that like they can collect partial payments and collect again. That doesn't really make sense, right? So we're probably just going to want to say like subscription dot amount is equal to the amount. We're going to want to make sure that that is true. And then the other thing that we're going to want to do is make sure that last paid was over 4 weeks ago. So we're going to want to say that subscription dot last paid. So the last time that was paid is going to be the current block.timestamp minus the last time that was paid should be greater than or equal to 4 weeks ago. Like I said, we don't have a month here, so you could just call in every month, or you could try to like program that in, but we don't have months here, so I'm just going to put weeks and do 4 weeks, which is close to a month here. So we'll go ahead and do that. So last paid was over 4 weeks. And then finally, we're going to go ahead and say subscription dot enabled. So we're going to require that it is in fact enabled. So yeah, that should probably do it for our requirements here. And then we're going to set last paid is equal to our block timestamp. And then finally, what we're going to do here is actually pay the collector. Right? So this part gets a little bit tricky if you want to do these external calls. I mentioned this idea that for a plugin, what you need to do, and this is based on the setup that we talked about in the previous video, right? With ERC-6900 plugins, you don't do delegate calls, right? So we are actually on a separate smart contract address from the smart account. So what we're going to want to do is we're going to call from the plugin back to the smart account to basically say, hey, I want you to call this collector with 10 native currency, right? 10 Ether or whatever, it's going to be the smallest denomination of that. We're just putting in 10. We didn't do 10 E18. So a really small amount, but we're going to want to call into the smart account and say, call this collector to pass them this 10, native currency, whatever it happens to be. So in order to do that, there is an interface called iPlugin Executor, which we can call. We know our smart account to be a plugin executor, so it's going to have certain methods on it. And then the smart account in this case is going to be the subscriber. Subscriber. So what the iPlugin Executor allows us to do is we can say execute from plugin, or what we want to do in this case is we want to say execute from plugin external. And what this is going to do is it's going to target some smart contract address, pass in some value, and pass in some data. So if we wanted to target a method on that smart contract address, we could do that in the call data. If we want to pass in some value, we pass in the value, and then the target is going to be the address, whether it's a smart contract or whether it's an externally owned address. So the target in this case is going to be the message sender here, right? That's going to be the collector, the person who's calling in here. The value is going to be that amount. And then the data, we're just going to pass in 0x. We don't want to pass in anything in this case. There's going to be no data being sent through. So we're just basically saying call out to that collector, send them through some amount, and there you go. Right? That's going to go ahead and send that through. So that should about do it for this. Yeah, we don't need to wire this up to do any sort of user op validation, because we're not going to be calling it through user op. We're going to be calling it directly from the subscriber. So this is actually all set up in this case, this collect function. You would want to think about the security of this function if it were called from a user operation and also directly through the smart account, but I do believe we're all set in this case. Of course, you always want to make sure that you audit your smart contracts, so to make sure that you didn't do anything you didn't expect to do. So okay, great. So let's go ahead and test this. So now we have this test, let's call this test subscribe function, and now we want to do test collect. So I'm going to go ahead and copy this down and just do a test collect here. That's basically going to be the same thing, but now we just want to add a little bit more to this. So in this particular case, we have subscribed. So we should have successfully subscribed by this point down here. And now what we want to do is we want to just be able to collect and make sure that we're able to collect successfully. So what we want to do in order to collect is we need to call from the service, right? We have the address for the service here, so we need to call from the service address. So we could do this VM prank as the service address. And then the other thing that we're going to need to do is we're going to need to skip ahead 4 weeks, because this is going to make sure that the timestamp from the last time paid is greater than or equal to 4 weeks. So we're going to have to skip 4 weeks. Fortunately, we have that for that, so we can go ahead and do that as well. And then we're going to want to call on the subscription plugin. We're going to want to go ahead and call collect. The subscriber in this case is going to be the account. So the address of the account 1, and the amount is the amount that they subscribe to, which is going to be that 10. Right? So if this works out properly, this service is just initialized up here, right? If this works out properly, then we should be able to see that we were able to collect 10 into our subscription, into our service here. So let's go ahead and try that down below here. So let's do that. We're going to go ahead and assert equal that our service dot balance is equal to 10. So let's go ahead and try that out. All right, sweet. It looks like it works. So, I mean, we could test this out with a few things to make sure that everything is working the way we expect it to. One thing, we could start putting in some error messages here so that we could say like, okay, less than 4 weeks, something like that. Let's see if we can trigger that. I mean, if this works the way I expected it to, then I think 3 weeks is not long enough if that timestamp is set up properly. So let's see if that throws in this particular case. Yeah. Says less than 4 weeks. So that does look like that's set up properly. If we go back to 4 weeks, we should see that we are still passing once again. Maybe we could test a couple of these other things. So there's the test there. Maybe we want to test that the amount is equal to the amount if we tried to collect more. So let's say we tried to collect 50. This shouldn't work, right? You should only be able to collect the amount that the owner of the smart account allowed you to collect as the collector. So there you go. It sees that it's reverting in that case. So great. So we made a very basic subscription plugin. So definitely try this out. I will make this code available so that if you want to extend this, if you want to build more into this, like if you wanted to make it so that maybe this 4 weeks is a variable that you could play with. So maybe you wanted to make it so that they could pass in how much time they want this subscription to renew, or maybe you wanted to do ERC-20 tokens and you wanted to be able to pull a certain number of ERC-20 tokens every so often, that sort of stuff. Definitely try it out. See what you can do here to be able to play around with this subscription plugin, and I hope you enjoyed this video on building ERC-6900 plugin.